know the benefits of Leys and livestock. That, you know, there's well-established evidence for increases in soil fertility, increases in earthworm populations, increases in soil organic matter, and then also reductions in weeds and improvements in climate resilience. And I suppose when you look at this, you know, the crop livestock integration and putting Leys into arable rotations is ticking a whole lot of different boxes, you know, in this whole area of climate change, soil policy, economics, water management, net zero targets, biodiversity, and so on. And so there's a sense in which it's fitting some of those bits of the jigsaw together, as it were. And then thinking about the different systems that we can use. I mean, I've talked about Leys briefly already. I mean, they're the obvious one, putting Leys back into arable rotations. Grass-only Leys, if they're going to be very productive, they'll need nitrogen fertilizers, so that's an extra cost. Legume-rich Leys, obviously, you don't need to put the fertilizer in, so they can be very good in terms of fertility building. And then there's this question about, well, are herbal Leys better? They've been selected for deep rooting. They contain species that have been selected to improve livestock health as a result of having anti-helminthic properties. And so there's suggestions in the literature that these would be better for both livestock health and for the soil than using just conventional grass clover Leys, for example. But the question is actually, to what extent is the evidence there to support that? And then I suppose the second major system that some farmers are using on arable land is winter grazing of crops. So very light grazing of winter cereal crops, which can control weeds and help promote tillering. And then grazing of winter cover crops that can provide livestock feed and then reduce the shoot biomass of some of those winter cover crops prior to spring sowing. And the diagram that you can see in this figure here shows you, you know, some of the examples of the herbal Ley species that have been selected for deep rooting, the sort of relatively shallow rooting of the ryegrass, white clover, red clover type system that perhaps has been used more conventionally in the past, and also the relatively shallow rooting of the winter cover crop species compared to these deep rooting herbal Leys. So one of the big claims of the herbal Leys is that if you get them well established, you can generate very much deeper root systems and potentially improve soil structure at depth, as well as recycling nutrients from depth and so on. And then in terms of the financial incentives, most of you will know this, of course, but you know, the use of cover crops, Leys, no tillage, low input cereal cropping, these are all things now which fall under the sustainable farming incentive actions, and the funding going towards these is tending to have increased in recent years. And these options are being taken up by many farmers. I mean, the multi-species winter cover crop is the third most popular of the SFI actions. And a large number of farmers also are starting to choose the herbal Ley option. But ultimately, the question is, how do these work, and how do you use them, and what benefits might you see, and also what snags and problems do you need to be aware of in using these in your rotations? The other big issue that's worth raising, actually, and particularly in relation to using nitrogen-fixing plants instead of nitrogen fertilizer, is just the extent to which, if we're going to, farming is going to move towards net zero targets, reducing nitrogen fertilizer use is going to be quite central to achieving those goals. Currently in the UK, we had about 1 million tons of nitrogen fertilizer. Only about 60% of that fertilizer is actually taken up by the crop. So 40% of that 1 million tons is lost to the wider environment. And farmers are paying for that, but it's also then causing pollution. To make that fertilizer releases about 7 million tons of CO2 equivalents. And then the other problem is that once that fertilizer is added onto the ground, under some conditions, it gets released again as nitrous oxide, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. And so overall, UK nitrogen fertilizer use, we add 1 million tons of fertilizer and we end up releasing about 17 million tons of CO2 equivalents from the manufacture and then the subsequent release of nitrous oxide. And you can see these figures from the government agri-climate report from 2022. You know, nitrous oxide is quite a significant, it's about 1/3 of our greenhouse gas emissions. And as I say, a lot of that is connected to our fertilizer use. The other aspect is the methane emissions from ruminants. And this is where, again, what livestock you graze on these lands does make a big difference in terms of emissions. And sheep are responsible for much fewer emissions than cattle. So if you sheep graze, then you're obviously going to have a lower emissions than if you run cattle on these pastures. And the other issue, I guess, with this is that sheep don't weigh as much as cattle, and so you may get less in the way of soil compaction as well. And then finally, thinking about how leys and cover crops might fit into regenerative farming and improving soil health. One of the key things here is that minimal or no tillage with 2 to 3 year leys. It rests the land from disturbance. The diverse leys will fix nitrogen, particularly if they've got legumes in them. They form an evergreen cover. They're keeping the soil covered. They feed the soil with roots, living carbon all year round, and that's really important. This is what really improves the soil. And then the grazing of the livestock on this can add manure and recycle above ground biomass into carbon. But I would also say having livestock on the land isn't essential in all cases. And certainly I know farmers that have got parts of their land used for grazing and parts of the land is used for silage production using red clover, for example, and then putting manure back onto that land. So there may be some situations in which it's not easy to actually integrate livestock onto parts of the land, but you can still use these systems in a livestock integration where the manure goes back onto the land. One of the ways in which we've been assessing and monitoring soil health, and particularly how it responds to different management practices, has been looking at water stable aggregates. So these are the crumbs in the soil which hold together when the soil is wet and slaked. And this is a key measure of soil health. Where the soil holds together in these crumbs, they're being generated by soil biology. They generate soil structures which improve drainage and water holding capacity, and they improve the carbon storage as well. You can see in this little picture here, a soil with good crumb structure and exactly the same field, which is under long-term arable, which the crumbs have disappeared because the soil has slumped and it's just packed. And so wet sieving the soil in this way allows us to look at these fractions. And this is what we did up at Leeds University Farm. We ran trials of some years ago where we put in grass and clover ley strips into long-term arable. And you can see within 3 years, this amazing physical transformation of the soil from material where there was slumping and winter waterlogging through to a really nice, freely draining soil. There's an earthworm down here, actually, it's very small, but and then you can see it's moving more towards the sort of soil we saw in the hedge. And what was really critical here was what was increasing was these water stable crumbs greater than 2 millimeters, so greater than 2,000 micrometers. They massively increased, and that increase represented an increase in carbon storage in those as well. The total carbon didn't statistically significantly increase, but the total carbon in that aggregate fraction, the large aggregates, massively increased by a factor of about 5 times, nearly 5 times more, and was statistically significant. And we began to realize that this was the key measure that allowed us to then monitor how soil health was improving over time. And it was linked, in this case, to when we stopped ploughing and grew these perennial grass and clover mixtures. What happened was the earthworm populations recovered. And in fact, the earthworm populations in the end ended up higher than in the adjacent long-term pasture land, partly because there's very high representation of clover. It fed the soil and it built a really strong positive feedback where the earthworms liked it, built better soil and stored a whole lot more nitrogen. And colleagues of mine that we were collaborating with from the University of York actually did experiments that I designed where they manipulated the earthworm populations in the field in big boxes of soil that was dug up and then put back in the field. And what this demonstrated very clearly was that where you've killed the earthworms and reduced the earthworm numbers compared to where earthworms were allowed to reproduce naturally or where they were supplemented, the hydraulic conductivity of the soil progressively increased with the larger numbers of earthworms. So basically that meant the water could pass through this soil faster the more earthworms there were in the soil. So the earthworms were basically restructuring this soil and improving its drainage. This is really important given the sort of weather that we're having these days, where we're losing hydraulic conductivity, ultimately leads to soils flooding and being poor at growing crops. So the other part of those trials, we put in a 3-year grass and clover ley strip into an arable field that we subsequently then direct drilled into this with wheat. And then we also had plots. This plot was, we had winter beans in, ploughed the year before. We had, excuse me, 3 years of growing winter wheat in a row in these other plots where we did various other manipulations in terms of different types of tillage and adding or not mycorrhizal inoculum. But what was really important, and you can see this actually here, this is the photograph looking at those plots. Look how dark green the wheat is growing on that former ley. We only added 35 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. We got just below national average yields. And much better yields than where we'd grown beans just for one year after ploughing. We also saw a big increase in mycorrhiza in the ley direct drill treatment and a reduction in pathology of the ears. So we used no fungicides in this experiment. So this led on to this bigger project that I led with collaborators, where we were looking at comparing herbal leys and grass clover leys. And there were a set of research questions. There are other questions also that Dr. Emily Cooledge will deal with shortly about how effective these different leys were for sheep as well. But our focus I want to put on this is really about soil quality, and then also what happens with the crops afterwards in this short presentation. So we had a whole set of sites that were involved in this project, but there were 2 key sites, the one at Loddington and the one at Duxford, that Lydia Smith will talk about shortly, where we had a combination of treatments, where we had leys, both types of ley, grass clover and a diverse herbal ley. We grew those leys for 2 years and then went back into cropping, or for 3 years and then went back into cropping. And we also had arable controls that were running alongside this. The leys were managed by grazing or mowing and removal, or mowing in situ. So we had a whole set of different combinations of treatments that ran over this duration of this project. And then, as I say, we returned into wheat cropping, either by ploughing or by direct drilling. So we were comparing the different tillage managements as well. So this is just showing you one of those field sites, what it looked like. So, we started off with a set of fields in the same rotation, but we then split one of these fields into the 2 types of ley. We had a mown part in the middle and grazed on the outside. And then after 2 years of ley, we then started to go back into arable with direct drilling or ploughing in strips. And then after 3 years of ley, we took the rest of it back, and we also had second wheats running off the ploughed and direct drilled plots that we'd used the previous year. And we also introduced here ploughing and harrowing into the control field as well. So it's ended up being this extremely complicated experiment, which has run now over 6 years. We've still been monitoring soil health post the 2 years of wheat cropping. I suppose the first thing just to draw your attention to was in the first year that we were back into arable, so this was after 2 years of ley, where we direct drilled in the heavier soils at the bottom of the hill on this dense earth clay, we had an almost complete failure. Whereas where we ploughed and harrowed, the wheat actually grew very well. But at the top of the slope, on the lighter soils, which were loamy brown earth, direct drilling worked extremely well right from the outset. And so there were clearly soil type differences here. The other thing just to note is we ended up with soil erosion in the areas that was ploughed, focused as a result of this sheep track that focused water pouring down here, it flowed across the surface of the direct drill plots and didn't cause any soil loss. Once it got into the ploughed, it then caused erosion. So interesting set of issues that followed from that. Now, this is probably the most important sort of findings from this work. What we found was that in those lighter soils at the top of the hill, after the Leys, the yields really went up compared to the long-term arable, and we were getting much better yields. And obviously they were better initially with ploughing than direct drilling, but nonetheless, even with the direct drilling, we were still getting much better yields than we previously had. And at the bottom of the slope, these yields were, again, were very, very good, except where we direct drilled. There was an enormous yield penalty because the crop failed because of the wetness of the soil at the bottom of the slope. However, the next year, so this is running where we had, these are 2-year Leys that have then had, this is second wheats, and 3-year Leys first wheats. And at the top of the hill, you can see, again, maintaining excellent yields, in this case, well over 12 tonnes per hectare of grain, and the direct drilling actually slightly better than the ploughing. First wheats after the Leys, the yields, there's a yield penalty, unfortunately, with direct drilling, and you can see the same was true at the bottom of the hill. But that terrible yield that we had on the 2-year Ley the previous year, actually the yields went up here with direct drilling, repeated direct drilling for the second year. So holding on to the next year and drilling again using a direct drill, actually we didn't lose the yield anymore. What's perhaps more interesting is when we also compared the difference between the grass clover Leys and the herbal Leys. Now, these are just the grazed areas. These aren't the areas that are mown. And the first big take-home message here is that the grass clover Leys outperformed the herbal Ley most of the time. So we were getting better yields. The other thing to say is that compared to our arable controls, all of these Leys are doing better, almost all of them. The only exceptions are these direct drilled first wheats on the herbal grazed of poorer. But on the grass clover, the yields were always better even than the arable control, even on the first wheats. So this is an impressive gain in yields, bearing in mind that we're using significantly less than normal fertilizing. And this is a sort of growth of the wheat that we had at the top of the hill here on these second wheats. The grain was really, really heavy, and there was very few weeds in this. It was a very clean system. We've continued to monitor soil quality here over the years, and this is from this last year. So this is now 2 years after that original study. So this is 6 years after the Ley started, as it were. And what's interesting here, just comparing the grass clover and the herbal Leys, the dark brown shows you these larger than 2 millimeter aggregates. So this is the stuff where the soil structure is really good. And the first thing to notice is that the grass clover Ley has built better soil structure than the herbal Ley because the values are higher on the dark brown. The second thing to notice is that, as you'd expect, direct drilled after 3 years of Ley is the best. If you ploughed after 2 years of Ley, we've reduced those benefits somewhat. And if it was ploughed after 2 years of Ley, so only 2 years of Ley rather than 3 years of Ley, again, this was the worst situation. And again, that's what we find with the herbal Ley. So basically, the less soil disturbance, the better. The longer you've got the Leys in, the better. And the grass clover Ley did better than the herbal Ley in terms of soil structure, and is maintaining that soil structure over time. And I think one of the other things just to point out is that with the bean crop that was put in last year, for example, where the bean crop failed, where we had direct drilling, then there was carryover of clover that had continued from the original Leys, and particularly in the grass clover Ley, this formed a complete carpet and maintain soil fertility and fertility building. And then the final couple of things just to point out, at this particular site, we found major reductions in weeds as a result of putting the Leys in. The best way to reduce the weeds was actually by mowing early, so we didn't get any grass flowering. With the grazing, we did have some flowering grasses that then obviously produced seeds. But on the other hand, so long as the soil was direct drilled rather than ploughed, then the amount of those weeds tended to be less. And the issue here also is that we've seen this carryover of some of the species from the Leys into the next crops with direct drilling in some of the other sites as well. And that includes, so you end up with these living mulches basically of white clover with direct drilling, and particularly where you've mown rather than grazed, that can be the case. And also some carryover of things like samfoin and chicory sometimes as well. So just to finish off, and again, acknowledge that this was part of a big project with lots of collaborators, all of whom we depended upon to do this work. What we can conclude from what we've done here at this particular site that I'm talking about at Loddington, herbal Leys were not consistently better than the grass clover Leys. Actually, having good growth of legumes may be the key to success, and that the grass clover Ley had a higher representation of legumes in it than the herbal Ley at this particular site. Are the herbal Leys better than grass clover Leys for crops? No, not consistently. Actually, the yields were often better after the grass clover Leys. Does the direct drilling retain better soil quality than ploughing after the Leys, and how does that affect yields? Well, the direct drilling can definitely incur a yield penalty on the heavier soils in the first year after the Ley, but direct drilling does maintain better soil structure, and where white clover was dominant in the Leys, this can continue as a living mulch for the following crops, and we're seeing benefits in terms of soil fertility and structure continuing now for 6 years over this rotation system. So I'm going to stop there and hand on to Emily, to Dr. Emily Cooledge, to then talk about her work, which deals much more then with the sheep side of things and the pasture side of things, from the trials that were run at the University of Bangor University. Now I just need to stop sharing. Let me just find the right.
All right, I think I've taken control of you, Jonathan.
Oh, that's fine.
It's all right. I'll steal it while we've got time. Thank you for that. That was a great introduction, and a good background to sort of the issues that a lot of UK arable agriculture is facing, as well as a good introduction to the Ley system that we typically use. So as a quick introduction to myself, I'm a postdoctoral researcher up here in Bangor University up in North Wales, and I'm just going to quickly run through my PhD research, which was about exploring the agronomic and environmental effects of herbal Leys on lowland sheep production. I'm just going to see if I can put on a pointer on my pointer options, laser pointer. That's better. I love having a pointer on a PowerPoint. So this is just a lovely photo of my research field up in North Wales. So it's in Abergwygan, which is along the North Wales coast. It's about sort of 10-20 minutes outside of Bangor, down the A55. So this was my grass clover field, and here I had couple of ram lambs in winter grazing, and then you've got some greenhouse gas chambers here in exclusion plots. So just remember that, because we're going to come back to that later. So there's a little bit of a background to our research topic. Obviously, as we know, since World War II, there has been a bit of a disconnect between arable agriculture and livestock agriculture. In particular, arable agriculture has predominated the east of the country and livestock is predominating the west of the country. And that specialisation of the two farming systems is really driving a lot of the environmental issues that we're seeing today. So the overuse of agrochemicals to kind of maintain yield, and the monoculture cropping sort of techniques that we use because it's highly efficient, also leads to major issues such as soil degradation, declining crop yield, a lot of greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with N fertilizer use, biodiversity loss from pesticide and herbicide use, and poor livestock productivity, predominantly in the west of the country, where sort of sheep are grazing the same fields over and over, and you're getting that parasite burden building up. Now, as all of these issues have quite significant environmental and economic costs, a lot of attention nowadays is shifting to whether or not we can introduce these temporary Leys, grasslands, into an arable rotation to see if we can improve productivity and alleviate these. So typically, all of these issues kind of cost England and Wales, just England and Wales alone, between 0.9 to 1.2 billion pounds per year. So it's a major economic impact on UK agriculture and the profit in this country. So the big question is, can we use a herbal Ley to solve the problem? Can we use a herbal Ley to increase the ecosystem services delivered by arable grasslands and by livestock agriculture? and so on and so forth. So just as a brief introduction, I know we've discussed herbal layers are a mixture of grasses, legumes, and herbs. So commercial herbal lay mixtures can contain anywhere between 10 to 18 different plant species. It's quite important to note that a lot of research previously done and completed is kind of on low diversity. We would consider it herbal lay mixtures. So that's anywhere between 3 species up to about 9 species. And they predominantly have the 3 fundamental groups. So they have the grasses groups, legumes groups, and herb groups. While really important and really scientifically valid, it doesn't naturally or accurately represent what's commercially used on farms around the UK, which is why it was really important for us on our SARIC project to use a commercial mixture and represent that. That was a big research gap we really wanted to fill. And these commercial herbal lays are kind of promoted currently in the SFI agri-environment schemes. As we said, you paid up to about £382 per hectare, but that comes with a lot of management stipulations. So you can't apply N fertilizers at certain times of the year. You can go on your field, how you manage it, you cut, mow it, graze it, etc. So all of these restrictions kind of give us things to work around and sort of questions to kind of look into. Now, a big component of these herbal lays is the different plant species in terms of the herbs, and in particular, we have a lot of bioactive herbs. And these bioactive herbs and legumes can be anything from sandfoin, chicory, or ribwort plantain, that's also called ribgrass, and they contain high levels of what we call plant secondary metabolites. So it's a compound that can have a secondary effect on an animal, so on a grazing ruminant, or on the soil health itself, so on the soil sort of microbial functioning. And when consumed, these plant secondary metabolites can manipulate nitrogen excretion. So this can either reduce or increase the amount of nitrogen that's being urinated or excreted in fecal matter. So that can have implications for nitrogen cycling in soils, the amount of nitrate leaching, and the amount of N2O emissions and ammonia emissions as well. PSMs can also act as a diuretic and increase sodium excretion. This can encourage the animal to actually drink more water. This can dilute the urine and reduce the damaging effect from urination in the field. It very much works a bit like a human having a cup of tea. That's the same sort of mechanism that's happening in the animal when they're grazing these bioactive species. Quite importantly for livestock productivity and health as well, PSMs can actually reduce the mobility and reproduction of gastrointestinal parasites in the sort of intestines of the animal. So it has anti-helminthic properties, which is really crucial for reducing the reliance on synthetic anti-helminthics. And potentially you can actually reduce the rumen fiber and protein degradation, and that has implications for reducing the amount of ruminant methane emissions that are produced during grazing. Unfortunately, a lot of the previous research has been done on either single stand species, where the species have been grown in isolation, cut, grazed, and fed to the animal, or like I've said previously, they've been sort of investigated in low diversity mixtures, so anywhere between 3 to 9 species mixtures. There is a massive lack and research gap for any of these properties working in a commercial mixture. And that's really important because obviously they're being promoted for agri-environment schemes and they're being promoted through seed companies, but there isn't much evidence to back it up. So one of the key things we really wanted to look at was how does it affect soil health? How do commercial herbal lays affect the grazing quality, the parasite burden, the livestock productivity, and the greenhouse gas emissions? So this is our BBSSC SARIC research project. It ran between 2019 to 2023. This is the project that Jonathan briefly just introduced towards the end of his talk. So we had a lot of arable sites. I've actually got the pictures of everyone there. That's better, I can see now. So we have all the arable sites down in Eastern England here, and originally the project was designed for us to do our livestock research down in east of England. Unfortunately, during COVID, Wales had a lot of travel restrictions, so we started a new field site up here in Henbys in North Wales. So this is our Henbys field experiment. It's a 2-hectare, 2-year field trial at our Bangor University research farm. So in this bottom sort of corner here was my grass clover sward. In this top quarter here was the herbal lay. And we employed a rotational grazing system. So we had about 40 lambs per sward per season. So it's quite a low number of sheep, but that was sort of so we didn't damage the sward for overgrazing. And these animals were moved between each paddock every about 4 to 5 days to kind of give the sward a chance to rest, recover, and we can make other measurements in the meantime. And here's the exclusion plots where we're taking our greenhouse gas samples and where we're taking our soil samples as well. And these were replicated throughout each paddock, etc. So up in North Wales, obviously, we're quite a lot wetter down than in the east of England. We have quite a low annual temperature and quite a high annual rainfall. So our soil is a lot heavier. We're on a sort of a brown, loamy soil compared to sort of the chalky soils that we get down in the east, chalky dry. So I'm going to just quickly run you through the results of my PhD. So during my PhD, we had 2 grazing seasons. They were kind of like the key focus as well as sort of our lab experiments. So in the autumn 2020 grazing season, we had ram lambs, and here's 2 pictures of my favourite ram lambs that we had. And they grazed for about, I think it's about 8 to 10 weeks on each sward type. At the end of the grazing period, they were slaughtered or sold. In spring, we had female ewe lambs, and they were sort of the second pick that we got from the Shepherd. And the idea was that we could improve them so that they were ready for breeding, and that they'd hopefully gain weight a little bit faster, depending on which diet they were on. So each season, at the start of each grazing season, we'd actually go on to measure the sward macro and micronutrient content and measure the sward yield. Now, I know Jonathan briefly mentioned that yields were greater in the arable sites, but in North Wales, we didn't actually see any difference in terms of yield between the herbal and the grass clover ley over the sort of 2-year experiment. We only saw one, it was quite annoying, one day right before the hay harvest in, I think it was summer 2021, where we'd had a very, very long drought, and the herbal ley was just slightly ahead in terms of yield of the grass clover ley, but obviously by the time you harvest the hay, it's a bit negligible. So that was quite cool. But in terms of the general nutritional quality of the grass clover and the herbal ley, they were actually surprisingly similar. We didn't see any differences in terms of crude protein content, the sugar, the digestibility, the ash or the oils between the 2 swards. But the only major difference we saw was between the micronutrients and the macronutrients. And in particular, over the course of the 2 years, we found that the macronutrient content and the micronutrient content was much higher in autumn 2020, where we had higher levels of sodium, calcium, magnesium, and also copper. And we also had higher levels of selenium and manganese as well. But in comparison, in spring, there wasn't really much of a difference between that and the grass clover ley. In particular, quite weirdly, sodium was brought up from the subsoil by the chicory, which are these sort of broadleaf leaves here. And you can see in the mixture, it is quite nice and diverse. You've got sheep's burnet, you've got some ribgrass there, you've got plantain, you've got loads of different grasses, you'll never be able to ID them all, and tons of clovers coming through as well. We also did decide to measure the nutritional quality of the hay that we'd produced in summer 2021. Again, we didn't see any differences in terms of the major properties like crude protein or sugar. Everything was kind of driven by the macro and the micronutrient content. So in general, it had a higher sort of nutritional quality just based off the macro and the micronutrients. And these generally tend to be above the recommended levels for grazing, for growing lambs, provided by I think it's the Cow 2020 paper. So we followed this through and we tried to see what was happening in terms of live weight gain. So we didn't see any difference in ram live weight gain, which is this ram live weight gain, which is these 2 panels here. So you had the grass clover lambs on the left and the herbal ram lambs on the right. So that's a bit of a tongue twister. And basically what we saw is that despite these are Welsh Mountain lambs, they're not a lowland breed. So for them to put on this much weight, it was actually quite impressive. But there was a slight difference. There was slightly more, but statistically, there wasn't any difference between the grass clover and the herbal ley. But the big differences we saw was a 15% increase in daily live weight gains in our herbal ewe lambs that grazed in spring. And this was primarily driven by the lower parasite burden. So this is the gastrointestinal parasite burden that occurred in our two seasons. So you had the autumn panel up here and the spring panel down here. So obviously these were our ewe lambs, these are our ram lambs. So unfortunately in the autumn season, we tried to naturally manage the parasite burden just by grazing the 2 swards to see if these anti-hominific claims are actually true or not. And it turns out in autumn, you can't manage them just using the swards by itself, probably because the plant secondary metabolite content of the swards in autumn were declining. We would love to have measured that, but unfortunately we ran out of budget and we ran out of time for that. But in spring, as you can see, you get this suppression of the parasite burden, and this is measured through fecal air counts. You get that suppression that continues until you get to sort of about 11 weeks in, and then it becomes an issue. So this dashed line was at what we called our dosing threshold. So by the time you get to 750 eggs per gram, then we hit them with, I think we used Zolvix, the anti-helminthic for that. So it was quite significant. It's about a 78% reduction in FEC scores by week 11. So that was great news in terms of our herbal ewe lambs. They required less intervention and less anti-helminthic. So it's healthier for them, and it's healthier for reducing anti-helminthic resistance as well. And we decided in the ewe lamb grazing season, so that's the spring grazing season, to follow it through. We could see there was better live weight gain. We could see there was suppression of the FEC scores. And we wanted to see, what does this mean in terms of the actual animal health? So we took some blood samples with colleagues from the University of Nottingham. So Dr. Nigel Kendall at University of Nottingham's vet school came out and helped us do some blood sampling. And basically our major findings was that you get a 41% higher plasma selenium and about a 22% higher plasma cobalt in lambs grazing the herbal ley. Although we saw higher levels of sward copper, manganese, etc., we didn't see that following through into the plasma. Hopefully with some longer term grazing that we would see improvements in those as well. Again, mainly because we didn't see any difference in the sward crude protein or the sward sugar content. We didn't see any difference in terms of the serum biogeochemistry or energy indicators, sort of the general biogeochemistry after about 11 weeks. So that was really promising because it was showing that you can improve the animal's mineral status, and that hopefully that reduces the dependency on sort of synthetic minerals, so lick blocks or injections or boluses or anything like that. So that should reduce the cost of producing lamb in the lowlands if you're grazing on a herbal ley. Obviously, the massive caveat of this data is that you can only bring, I mean, the soil's deep rooting, the herbal leys that are deep rooting, they're bringing up nutrients from the subsoil. But those nutrients, if they don't exist in the soil types that you're on, they're not going to be brought up. So it is the caveat is it's very soil type dependent. So it is worth soil testing, seeing if you can test your soil at the different layers, seeing you can send it away to, I think it's NRM, do a micronutrient suite. And so you can see which ones you might get if you employ an herbal layer in your field trial. So the next thing we kind of looked at was the nitrogen cycling and urine composition. And this is a nice bottle of the herbal layer urine that we collected. We applied this into a fake urine patch to measure differences in soil biogeochemistry, so soil pH, nitrogen cycling, and carbon cycling. And we also went a bit further and measured the actual chemistry of the urine, because the idea was that if they're grazing these lovely plantain leaf here, as well as some chicory there at the back, the idea is if you graze that, can you reduce the amount of nitrogen that's being excreted in the urine of the animal? And the problem is with nitrogen in urine is that it's so readily available to the microbes, it's utilized super quick, and that can produce a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. It can produce N2O, which is very potent. It's about 298 times more potent than CO2 as a global warming potency. And it also produces ammonia, which is obviously very bad for the environment and something that we'd like to control as well. And obviously I said that there was higher sward sodium in the actual sward of the herbal ley, and this followed through into the urine sodium composition. So this is this bottle line here. So this left-hand bottle here is the herbal ley urine that we collected. So we collected each individual urine event from the animal, measured that for the sort of the basic urine chemistry. We also measured the sheep dung as well. I think we collected about 20 to about 40 litres of urine. It was quite a lot of urine. And when the sheep pee about 180 mils each time, it takes quite a long time. So this was the herbal ley urine, which was obviously quite a lot more dilute. You can just see visually there's a difference between this urine and the grass clover urine here. So as the herbal ley urine kind of represents a bit of a cider, this grass clover one's a bit more of a stout. And this isn't necessarily the hydration status of the animal. This is just how much they're urinating. So as you can see in autumn 2020 of our ram lambs, the urination volume increases massively in the herbal ley fed sheep compared to that of the grass clover sheep. And these sheep were all similar weights, they're all similar ages. So it's primarily driven by the sward status and obviously them consuming the sward. The downside is by urinating a bigger urine patch, so by urinating a bigger volume of wee, this increases the nitrogen loading rate that's deposited to the pasture. So although the total N content doesn't change whatsoever, that volume increasing massively increases how much nitrogen is being excreted onto the pasture to about 1,000 kilograms, 1,000 kilograms of N per hectare. And obviously that sodium content, you're applying so much sodium in that urine as well, and that kind of massively has a negative effect on microbial activity and on nitrogen cycling. And although we did measure differences in soil nitrate, soil ammonium, total nitrogen, total carbon, we didn't see any major differences. After we apply that urine to the field and then we measure it for about, I think it's about 12 weeks, weirdly, this doesn't really do much. I think the sward is so nitrogen hungry because we don't apply any fertilizer nitrogen. It just snatches all the nitrogen before it has a chance to do anything negative. And we followed this through in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and we were measuring the N2O emissions. And although the field was semi-dry, sort of neutral territory for the water-filled pore space, we didn't actually capture any N2O emissions. It sort of was a bit negligible, which was very bizarre. We weren't expecting that. And we thought we were going to have a lovely peak, urination peak, in the N2O emissions, and we could track that down and develop a new emission factor to contribute towards our global inventory. So on a positive side, we didn't really get any N2O emissions, but on a negative side, we can't actually see if the sward has any effect on nitrogen cycling, because it was kind of hidden by unknown factors, really. But we did take some of the urine that we collected from the autumn, and we did a mesocosm, so basically a lab scale experiment, where we measured ammonia emissions over time. So we measured ammonia emissions for about 12 days. And what we found is that we found a massive reduction in ammonia emissions from the herbal ley, which is this bottom red line here, and the grass clover ley, which is this the blue line up here. So there's a 58% reduction in ammonia emissions from urine that's applied to a herbal ley sward compared to urine that was applied to a grass clover sward, which is fantastic because it's 50% lower than the UK average emissions for cattle and sheep grazing, which is provided by DEFRA. So we've shown that somehow, we don't know how, we're still trying to just identify the mechanism that controls it. Herbal ley urine actually reduces ammonia fertilization compared to grass clover urine. And these results are standardized on the percentage of urine nitrogen that was applied. So that's not a factor in this sort of equation here. So that was really positive because we're reducing one source of pollution from grazing livestock on the lowland compared to other swards, more conventional swards, which was our grass clover sward. And then finally, we kind of explored in a bit finer detail the differences in sward quality. So in our exclusion plots for 1 year, I think it's towards the end of the summer, so we'd already cut for hay, which is why it's lovely and short here. And in our exclusion plots, we decided to let it flower just to see what does it do in terms of biodiversity, which is why we have some lovely blue chicory flowers up here. And our research farm goes from sort of lowland up to the mountains, which is why we have a lovely view of the mountains up there. And one of the major things that we did that was really quite interesting was take some intact soil cores from our key plant species within the herbal ley and within the grass clover ley. And we took them to the University of Nottingham's Hounsfield facility, which was an X-ray micro-CT suite. And basically this is an X-ray machine, and you can put soil cores inside here or intact structures, and you can measure differences in porosity, pore volume, pore connectivity, etc. And like Jonathan was saying about infiltration and things like that, these factors are really important for knowing the sort of infiltration and the airspace that's going on in the soil. So it's an indicator, a really good indicator of soil health. The idea being that the differences in the root structure, so chicory, this one, it has a massive taproot. And the idea is when this taproot goes down to the subsoil, it basically fractures open the soil, creates airspace, and then that increases sort of microbial activity. Hopefully the earthworms that are then kind of summoned, if you want to call it that, by the plant litter come, they make earthworm burrows, that increases the connectivity of the pores, increases infiltration, hopefully reduces flooding. That's kind of the key ethos. So we had 9 cores, so random grass mixture, grass and legume mixture from the herbal ley, 3 cores of the plantain, which is the ribgrass, which is also a taproot, and then 3 cores from our chicory. And then we destructively sampled these after we did the major intact core scanning to look at the differences in the soil aggregates. And I know Jonathan talked about aggregate stability, and we also made some measurements of that as well. So this is just a quick 3D photo of the soil structure that we got from each core. So this was the plantain. So here you can see it's quite a narrow taproot that goes all the way down. This is a 10 centimetre core, so obviously it is cut off, unfortunately. But you can see it has this sort of narrow taproot that goes down and a lot of lateral side roots that help sort of split open the soil structure. Whereas in comparison to chicory, it has one major, quite wide taproot, along with some very lateral, surprisingly, roots that sort of go with it. And that is fracturing open the soil. And I'll show you a video of that in a second. Whereas in comparison with the glass clover mixture, it's almost like a thick knot. It's a bit like a hairball of all the different roots that go in. And to actually image this on X-ray CT and kind of develop a root model is actually quite difficult because it's so hard to tell apart all the different plants and how they contribute and follow that through with the resolution of the data as well. And one of the big things we did was actually video these. So this was a chicory core here. So as you can see, this one, when it rotates around again, this is a huge earthworm that was inside the core. And when this obviously moves on and leaves, that means a massive burrow of space, airspace through the core, helps with the sort of the cycling and the infiltration as well. And all of these blue dots here are basically representing air throughout the soil column, which is really cool to see. The brighter the colour, the bigger the pore. So there are some little small roots here that have left big pore channels. You can see the lateral fractures in the soil and the pore space that's associated with it. We then took this soil column, we dried it, we destroyed it. Some of the aggregates from here were followed into these. So this is a very, very small syringe. And it actually has about a 4mm aggregate sitting inside it, which is this one here. I don't know if I can get this one to play again. Probably, yeah. So this is the soil structure inside the soil aggregate. So this is about 4mm. So this is tiny, tiny scale that we're talking about. So this is using even smaller nano CT. And this is all of the airspace that's associated with that. So the tiny mycorrhiza, the tiny roots are helping build up that soil structure. And hopefully when these aggregates clog together, they sort of clump and make new soil. This improves the soil structure overall. Unfortunately, though, we didn't see any differences in the topsoil porosity or the aggregate stability between the herbal ley and the grass clover ley. And I think part of the issue with that is we had quite a lot of earthworms in our soils, and I'll show you that in the next slide. And all of those earthworm barriers kind of negate the beneficial effect of the species. So if we were to repeat the research again, we probably would do it where we could remove the earthworms so that we can just look at the root benefits in isolation effectively. So this is just a very quick, because I'm aware that I'm kind of going on for a while now. So we did do some measurements of microbial activity and microbial diversity, which is sort of this Shannon diversity index here. Unfortunately, we didn't see any differences in terms of microbial diversity, same as earthworm abundance and earthworm biomass. Again, there was no major differences between the different sort of earthworm groups between the two swards. So it was a little bit disappointing, but, you know, to be expected. So just to kind of sum up that research, I appreciate it was a bit of a whirlwind, but, you know, feel free to ask any questions and I'll try and help where I can. Herbal leys are beneficial and they can deliver some ecosystem services, improve, you know, things like infiltration, improve livestock health and productivity, etc. They're not necessarily a silver bullet for UK agriculture. There are a lot of issues that come with herbal leys in terms of management. Obviously, a lot of the benefits are soil type specific and they're also management specific as well. So although in this research we did see higher sward and micro and macronutrient content and greater lamb live weight gain and low effect scores, so fecal egg count scores, so parasite burden effectively. And we did see that really beneficial reduction in ammonia volatilization. The results are highly seasonal, and obviously it depends on, particularly your livestock, it depends on the starting point for your livestock as well. You know, you can't improve something that's starting off from quite a bad point in the politest PC way I can say it. We didn't necessarily see an effect on nitrogen cycling, which is a bit disappointing. We would like to do repeat years so that we can really, you know, narrow it down and see what's actually driving it. obviously there are some downsides that we didn't really anticipate with the herbal ley, in that we did get high urinary sodium excretion, so that can have sort of a salinity effect on the microbial community within the urine patch. By increasing the urine urination volume, and without changing the nitrogen content that's being excreted, you can get a higher urine nitrogen loading rate. So as you saw, it's about 1,000 kilograms of N per hectare, which is obviously quite a lot. Multiply that by how many sheep you've got, and then it becomes a bit of an issue. And we didn't see any improvement in the many sort of soil physiochemical properties that we did explore. So that was a bit of a shame. We would have liked to see more dramatic differences. Potentially, if we'd done the research down in the east of England, we would have seen those dramatic differences. Obviously, our starting point for this experiment was a grassland field going into a new type of grassland, so the soil was already semi-improved to start with. So just briefly want to say thank you to the massive amount of people that helped with all of this research, as well as all the different funding support that we received from UKRI, SARIC, British Society of Soil Science, Murdoch University in Australia as well. And if you are interested and you do want to read up about this PhD research, then I have 2 published papers. They are open access, so anybody can access them wherever. You're welcome to Google them, or you can email me and I'll send them to you. We have got one more in development on the nitrogen paper that should be out hopefully next spring, and I can share that around if needed. So yeah, thank you for listening. Sorry, it's a bit of a whirlwind. I'm going to pass on to Lydia now, who's going to talk about the Centre for High Carbon Cropping. Is it High Carbon Cropping Capture? And she will also briefly talk about the results from the BVSRC SARIC project, particularly the arable results down in east of England.
Thank you, Emily. And can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep, can hear you.
Now, you've probably both left me not quite enough time. I'm going to dash through these slides. They're going to be recorded, so you can perhaps have a look at them in a bit more detail afterwards. So I'm going to skip this completely. I think that one of the things that we really worried about in this project and others that have come after are all of the things that could be happening to the soil, and listed there really all of the possible negative outcomes we could have from an excessive input system. Let's leave it there. But I think probably soil carbon content is one of the things that I've really chased over the last few years. So I'm probably going to concentrate on that a little bit more. Now, Jonathan has beautifully introduced the structure of this rather complex piece of work. And I think one of the things that's going to come out of my talk is that in comparison with some of the results that Jonathan got, and indeed Emily, where she's talked about soil, there are some really major differences. And I think it really underlines that it's vital to look at different climates and different soil conditions when you have apparently, you know, a simple difference. Are we looking at a grass ley or a complex herbal ley? But you're going to get different answers. So dashing straight into the data, this is some of the first year results from Duxford. Now, this is a very light soil sitting, it's quite deep, but it's sitting on top of chalk. So it's very different from what Emily had in Wales. And it's actually quite different to what Jonathan talked about mainly at Loddington. So not talking about the ley very much, but straight into the following crop, which was winter wheat, going back into that after 2 years. And you can see we've got the direct drill on the left and we've got the plough on the right, with grazed and mown shown in orange and blue. And I think the most obvious thing that comes out of this is that for a direct drill, the first year back, there was a yield penalty compared to the arable control. So here's the arable control. I would like to stress though that the nitrogen input that we had for the Leys was half that throughout that went into the arable control. So where we're getting under plough, pretty much the same here for the arable control with the herbal going back into wheat, then that's really great in terms of the sort of outcome, because we're using considerably less nitrogen there for the same result. Now the next year, a little bit more complicated. So in fact, what we have is 2 years, then wheat followed by wheat. And in here, we're going back into wheat after 3 years lay. And we've got the direct drilled in the top and the ploughed in the bottom. So I think the key point that comes out here is that some of that nutrient lockup that we had going through into the first year wheat after the lay, be it a herbal lay or a grass lay, has resolved itself. And so here we have a look, the arable control running through it. And here's the arable control for the ploughed versus the direct drill. But the take-home message here is that we're getting more, even for considerably less wheat. We've halved the amount of, sorry, not wheat, with nitrogen, we've halved the amount of nitrogen, but we're getting a yield boost coming back from these lays. And that was what we hoped for, but it was really nice to see it, that we have that boost even with the reduced nitrogen. And again, as we would sort of expect, we've got that slight penalty going back in the first year. We've got lockup of nutrients before they really start to mineralize down from the impact of the worms and the soil microbial community and so forth. So a lovely result that we've got all of those positive impacts that Jonathan in particular talked about in terms of the soil structure, but we're also getting a yield boost for less cost. Right, a bit of a complicated slide, so let me just take you through it. Now, this is a different soil again. This is a really heavy soil. It's heavier than we have in the Welsh site, but we've got the warmth and the lower rainfall that is associated with the east. This is Great Dunmow, E.W. Davies farm. This is a little bit different actually as well in terms of the management. So whereas at Duxford, we essentially had a mass grazing, a mob grazing, I should say. The farmer at Great Dunmow pretty much put his stock on and left them on. And so they're not absolutely comparable. But let's take the first one here. This is establishment. We go to dry matter and then ear dry matter later on. First of all, into establishment. So this was probably worrying him in that first instance, that there really was a much lower establishment following the lay. So this is going back into wheat, and then we've got a low establishment, and particularly after the herbal was really quite low numbers. Here is the arable control in terms of establishment. But look what's happened now. As we get down to growth stage 30, the wheat's beginning to catch up, and in fact it surpassed already the arable control as we get to growth stage 30. And then finally, when we're setting the ears with the ear dry matter, nearly all of the treatments are above the arable control. You've got a couple here in the cross clover lay, which are actually doing less well than the herbal lay. So this contrasts a little bit with some of the results that Jonathan and Emily showed. Again, stressing that the different soil type and the different conditions are giving you a slightly different result. And then finally, we've got the ears. So this is the yield effectively. Look at the yield now. This is lovely. We're getting a nice yield here compared to the arable control. So this worrying start where we've got a fairly lower level of establishment is caught up and giving us a nice yield. And this is the straw dry matter. So probably not so important in terms of what farmers are hoping to get out of this. Right, let's just change tack a second. So let's have a look at the Met data for the last few years. Now, one of the reasons that I've taken some of this work on, and I'll tell you about that in a moment, is that we're looking to not only improve soil structure, but also to sequester carbon into the soil and into the crop and hopefully into other products. So here's the Met data for spring 22. So red means it's a bit warmer than normal, taking into account what was going on in the last 10 years. Brown means dry, so we had a very dry spring in 22, and yellow means higher level of sunlight hours. So that's the spring of 22. Look what's happened by the time we get into the summer of 22. Hot, 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 really dry, and lots of sunlight hours as you'd rather expect from that. What about 23? Well, a completely different situation. So we've got average temperature in spring. We've got it really wet, 170% of what was expected over those 10 years. And going into the sunlight hours, cold, and not very many sunlight hours. So we really expect different outcomes. I flagged that up because I think it's important to see whether these new systems will cope under these very different situations, but also to get a feel for you know, what are the different factors that might affect those outcomes. And here's the summer. So quite hot, still really wet now. So it's warmed up a little bit after that very cold start, and still not so much sunlight as you expected. So here in the east, we suffered such a wet period during that year, and it really had an impact on what we were doing. The water table never went down below about a foot in some of our deeper, wetter fenland soils. So I've taken this work on to the next stage, which is we've got a 4-year project which I'm leading now called the Centre for High Carbon Capture Cropping. So what is happening in the soil and what's happening in the crop. We've been looking at 4 different crops. I'm not going to talk about any of them except for the Leys, but just suffice it to say that we're looking at fibre crops, perennial food, which I'm going to talk about today, perennial biomass, and rotational cover crops, which Jonathan mentioned briefly. So there they are. Now, we then thought, let's have a look at comparing different types of Leys, because we only really looked at one Ley, and Emily mentioned several times that there are a number of Leys going out there that you can get from different providers. So we decided to look at 3 different types compared to an old fashioned grass clover Ley, if you like, and then we put them at 2 very contrasting sites. So we've got the Cambridge site, which is just a little bit across country from that fairly dry, chalky soil at Hinxton, and we're comparing that to a fairly poor, brashy, stony soil. And we drilled that in 23, and we will carry on looking at that until 26. So here's the makeup. You can perhaps come back and have a look at these later. This is the all singing, all dancing, 16 species and a number of different varieties. Here's the medium diversity ones, so trying to pull out the most important species, making it maybe a little bit cheaper, maybe a little bit easier to establish that. And then this is the very simple, so these are just repeats of different ryegrass and clover. And then an unusual one here. We brought this in as a result of discussions with farmers. What if we had a grass-free system? And this is because a lot of arable farmers, particularly if they're going into root crops, they were thinking, well, I don't really want lots of grass, and then I'm going back into potatoes and other root crops. And there's a problem now with wireworms and leather jackets and whatnot. So we brought that in as a contrast. Here's what they look like when they first establishment. It's a fully replicated trial on a very level site, so we can hope to get some decent data out of this in terms of comparison. We're going to look at all of the different components of the web. Where's the carbon going? Where's it going in terms of the roots, into the microinvertebrates, the macroinvertebrates, and so forth. And that will be a bit of a watch this space. No results to show you yet, but we've only just established that a year or so back. But the STAR project has been going for 18 years. So pretty much going down again to the other end of the spectrum. It's been going for 18 years. It's on a heavy clay loam, not unlike the one you saw at the E.W. Davies farm. And we're looking at different types of tillage. So this is the other thing that we haven't discussed in fine detail. Yes, we looked at a plough versus a direct drill, but there's various other different types of tillages. So these have been going for some years. And so it was a really nice opportunity. We brought it in to have a look at how that would impact it. You can download this from the NIAB site. It's called the STAR project. As you can see, it's been going for many years, and we follow agricultural practice. And we brought in the herbal Ley 19, 20, 21. So what happened as a result of that? So here is our STAR yield data, 22. So this is the first year back into a crop. And here's a comparison with what the yield was looking like. And I should say that this work is very much under the direction of Dr. Nathan Morris and Dave Clark, my colleagues at NIAB. So the herbal Ley, and bearing in mind that this, as I said, is a very heavy, I can't stress how heavy this is. It's a really heavy, dense soil. And so when we went back into Ley at low nitrogen, which is orange, or high nitrogen, which is blue, I was very pleasantly surprised that the Ley did brilliantly in comparison to the spring cropping and the winter cropping. So this is the wheat going through after that Ley. So that was our first year back from the Ley. And then here is the second year back. So this is like a comparison to what we were doing at Duxford. So we have the herbal lay results here, the spring cropping, the winter cropping. The continuous wheat doesn't do very well under any circumstances. And I guess the take-home message here is that irrespective of tillage, so we've got the deep non-inversion, we've got the shallow non-inversion versus the plough and the managed, but the take-home message is that the herbal lay increased yields under low nitrogen compared to conventional break crop rotation, and no significant difference between the high and the low nitrogen results. So a nice result. Now, what does that mean in terms of your money? Obviously, the key question that every farmer is going to ask. And I think this is really interesting because the cost of nitrogen is really driving the outcome now, isn't it, of your gross margin. So looking at those 2 years, and they're very uncomparable, as I already said, you've got the very dry, hot year followed by that cold, wet year. But what we saw was that the gross margin under year 17, so that's the 22 year, the low nitrogen and the spring and winter crops were coming out just on top of the low nitrogen, and the high nitrogen, the lay was doing really well. And under 23, we were getting a slightly different outcome. And this is, again, we'd expect this because we've got that greater mineralization that's happening following 2 years. And the high nitrogen now is doing incredibly well under the spring and the winter crop, but the lay is doing best by quite a margin under the low nitrogen. And I think considering that a lot of farmers are looking at slightly lower input systems and are looking for a lower nitrogen input, that was a lovely result, which we were very pleased to see. So we will be looking at this again. I just want to show you what happened in spring 24. So that's this year. I don't think any farmers need to be told that it was continuing to be really wet in spring this year. It made establishment of the next crop incredibly difficult. It was dark, even though it was quite warm. So this year, that rain meant that we couldn't drill in the autumn like we meant to. We couldn't drill in the spring. It was still absolutely sodden. So we've gone back into a lay, which we always intended to do, but a little bit later. So that's gone in July this year. And we will be looking at that in terms of the many factors we're considering under the Centre for High Carbon Capture Cropping. So we're going to look at soil structure, soil organic matter, microorganism activity, worm numbers, diversity, all of these sorts of things that are going on in the soil, as well as the outcomes in terms of money in your wallet. So that's another watch this space. Lots of people working with us in this activity, and there'll be all sorts of things that are covering some of those other crops. I don't know whether I mentioned, but if you go on the carbon capture cropping web pages, so it's carboncapturecropping.com, you will be able to sign up for our newsletter and find out more about what we are doing. And I'm not sure how to stop sharing that, but if I can possibly ask you, Emily, to take back control. There you go. So I hope that I've brought back a little bit of time in order to allow some of our participants to ask some questions. Just before I do actually hand back to Emily, one thing I'd like to say is that we've been looking at things like nitrous oxide emissions at these various sites, and that also is a really mixed story. So different results from the farm at Honeydale in the Cotswolds, and different results here at NIAB at Hinxton. And I think, again, you cannot be sure that you're going to get the same results. But one thing that we did notice at the Honeydale site is that comparing nitrous oxide emissions right across the year, we got incredibly low emissions at Honeydale, but quite a spike when the nitrogen input went in under an arable situation, and a little spike actually for a grass lay. So yes, we just have to keep looking at these different systems and not necessarily expect you're definitely going to know the answer. Back to you, Charlotte.
Thank you so much, Lydia. That was really quick. So I appreciate you keeping things so well to time. And we might be able to come back and touch on any other points that you feel like you didn't manage to get to as well. So we have a few questions in the chat, and please continue to put them in there. You could also raise your hand, I think, in this, since we're in a meeting format. So I'll just go back because Jonathan's had a rest now, so I can go back and ask him a couple of questions that came up during his presentation. So one of the questions was to do with when you were looking at measuring aggregation, and could you give some details about how you measured that and the equipment used to measure soil particle aggregation, please?
Yeah, it's very simple. All you need is a 2mm standard analytical sieve, so it's stainless steel sieve, and a washing up bowl, and some way of measuring the volume of water in the washing up bowl initially. So we end up with a marker pen, and we put a black line in the washing up bowl so that when the sieve is sitting on the bottom of the washing up bowl, the water goes up inside the sieve to about 1.5 centimeters above the mesh, but it stays within the wall of the sieve. And then we simply put 60 grams of fresh soil sample onto that, and we wet sieve 50 strokes, counted carefully through that, and then the soil that goes through the sieve is gathered, and the soil that stays on the sieve is gathered. The stuff that's on the sieve is your greater than 2mm water stable aggregate, and the soil that's gone through is the disaggregated part. And then the final stage is we pick all the stones out of the section that's been sitting on the sieve that's greater than 2mm, because we separately weigh all the stones that are in that fraction, because we're only interested in aggregated soil. And it's as simple as that. And I mean, I've demonstrated this at the Great Yorkshire Show. I've received samples from farmers, and actually I've demonstrated this in the field with farmers as well. So, and then you send off those 2 samples for analysis. And that's just that, and then you get your carbon analysis for the 2 fractions and the weight of the 2 fractions. You need to weigh the 2 fractions. And that's your measure of soil. That gives you your robust measure of soil health and how it changes over time as a result of your management interventions.
Thank you. I'm sure we're going to have plenty of farmers emailing us asking where do they send their soil aggregate measures over to. Thank you for that, Jonathan. I'll go now to Emily. So we had one question which is more to do with the finance side of things. So the question was that given that sheep are often the least profitable part of a farming business, especially if they're benchmarked as a sort of standalone enterprise, if a farmer is looking to diversify to a mixed system by adding sheep into an arable rotation, has the cost benefit analysis been looked into, and was there a benefit to the profitability of the farm overall?
So that is a really good question. We can't really talk too much about sort of a financial analysis, cost benefit analysis. That was one of the things we wanted to do on our SARIC project. Robin said research, we're going to conduct that economic analysis for us. Unfortunately, we ran out of time with our project, so it didn't get done. In terms of profitability for sheep, obviously I can talk about our experience down at Henvice, where we were sort of producing our sheep. We did get a better price when we took them to slaughter or when we took them to market for the herbal low ones that did gain more weight. Obviously in terms of antihelminthic, you are saving some money because you're not needing to dose as much as normal. Same with macro and micronutrient content. If you're not buying boluses, you're not buying injections, you're not buying salt licks, that does save you some money as well. In an ideal world, it would be great to have that economic analysis done. Unfortunately, we just run out of time, and that is something that I'm hoping future researchers get completed pretty sharpish, I suppose.
Great.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think when you look at these economic analyses, you need to look at the whole rotation, because what we're seeing is clear evidence of fertility building, which is variable depending on the composition of the Leys and how they're managed. And so as Lydia's pointed out, and as we showed, you can get these major fertilizer savings in your arable crops after you've built up the fertility and the soil properties. So your input costs drop, but your yields can be more resilient to more extreme weather and so on. So I think, as I say, this is why producing a single number from one site or from one study is not straightforward. And I wouldn't then extrapolate to all sites on the basis of that. But I would also say we need to continue to collect data across multiple sites for multiple years to really understand how these systems work, because yes, you may not make much money in the years you've got the sheep on the system. You may even lose money, but actually you may well end up making more money in the long run through the whole rotation because of reduced inputs and higher yields and greater resilience. That's the hope. It may well be that actually it doesn't make a huge difference, but I suspect it does actually. And I think certainly this issue about saving fertilizer, I mean, we're seeing, we achieved yields matching national average yields using only 35 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare on one of our trials, for example. So, you know, quite substantial fertilizer saving costs. And again, it depends on what the costs of the fertilizer are in the particular year.
Yeah, so I've got two questions I want to answer, which follow on very nicely from what you were saying, Jonathan. So David and Edward ask about tillage and nitrogen inputs. So for Edward's point of view, we put 0 nitrogen on the Leys, as you would expect, but then when we disrupted the Leys and went back to arable wheat, winter wheat in this case, we put full nitrogen, 240 kilos per hectare on the arable control, so similar to what Jonathan showed in his experiments at Loddington. But for the land that had gone from the Ley, it had 50%, so it only had 120 kilos per hectare, and that continued on to the next year. So it could be that you might have expected that the yield would start to suffer by the second year, but actually, as you saw, it gave us an enhanced yield in the second week after the Ley. And I'll just answer that question from Dr. David Purdy, if I may, Charlotte. There are 4 treatments on the STAR site. You can go and have a look at it. You can download more detail. I had to rush through it a little bit, but essentially we were looking at high tillage, high input tillage going through medium to low. So the shallow non-inversion is literally just a rip. So it's the kind of minimum tillage without actually going to a full direct drill. The deep rip is a bit more disruptive, and of course you know what a plough is. So we were trying to go for as minimal disturbance as possible. And I didn't talk about the 4th treatment, which is managed. So what we do in managed is we decide what the issue is for that year, and therefore what tillage would be best, considering all things like weather, rainfall, crop choice and whatever. And so we will always go for the least amount of tillage that we can get away with. And in that context, it's interesting that we've, as you might expect in a very heavy, fully arable soil, we have blackgrass issues at that site. But one of the things that was really encouraging was that after 3 years Ley, we had significantly hit that blackgrass infestation.
That's great. Thank you, Lydia. You beat me to it. So that means I'll go back to Jonathan. So someone did a good quote in the chat saying, an American expert once said to me that herbs in a Ley should be like seasoning in a stew, small amounts added to a predominantly grass-based sward. And he suggests that here in the UK, we might go over the top with the herb quantities. Do you think that this could be why the grass clover Ley outperformed the herbal Ley? And I guess to that, I might add a secondary question, which is that, do you just think the benefits of herbal Leys are seen more in the livestock, as we saw from like Emily's presentation, rather than in the soil micro and macro fauna?
I think the one thing I didn't say, and probably should have done, was that at all of our sites we use the same 16 species mix, but actually at each of the sites different combinations of species established. And at the Loddington site, the sainfoin and the sweet clover didn't really get established. So they were major parts of the seed mix, and they were major components of the legume composition which were successful at Duxford. So that's one of the issues, is about establishment of the species. So yes, I think the issue isn't so much about herbs, actually. I think it's about legumes. I think the reason why the grass clover system can sometimes work better is that you can get a higher representation of clovers, and then you get more nitrogen fixation. And I think the fertility building, and the other thing is that earthworms absolutely love clovers. There's very strong literature evidence on this, that if you have a lot of clover in your sward, you can build up the earthworm populations faster. So I think, in short, I think getting a good composition of legumes is really important. If you can get those deep rooting and large legumes in the system established, the herbal ley will be better probably. And that's what happened at the Duxford site, for example. But on the other hand, on some of the soil types, and depends on the pH and various other things, some of those big deep rooting legumes don't get established, and you're actually better to rely on the clovers. And then, yes, some of the anti-helminthic species are good and they're helpful, but I would also say at the end of the day, you do want a good mixture of grass, clovers, and forbs in the mixture. And if it's unbalanced, then it probably doesn't work quite so well. It's my view.
I'm gonna add to that, if I may, Jonathan. So I mean, that question was in quite early on after Jonathan's talk, but I think you compare some of the results from the Loddington site to the Duxford and E.W. Davies sites. The herbal ley actually performed better than the grass ley in that circumstance. So, you know, this is what I was stressing. And I think you're quite right. It's easy, I think, for some of these mixtures to rather overdo the legumes and herbs, and then perhaps you don't get a good mixture. But interestingly, and we didn't think this would happen, at the very heavy Star site, we got a really, really thick sward. It was ramified with grassroots right from the start. And the sandfoin did establish, which doesn't necessarily do under a rather heavy wet site. So you never can be absolutely sure. And I think it's all about getting the establishment right, not going in too late in the year and not grazing too much too early.
We'll say as well for hen lice, sorry, Jonathan, just for hen lice in particular, I know one of the concern is obviously having that open sward and having that sort of exposed soil to sheep trampling, etc. And one of the things we were quite particular to do was to cross stitch it a few times. So we kept going over broadcast seed, different directions, rolled that seed into the soil surface after we'd ploughed, just to make sure we had maximum coverage. And I think we put on enough for 1 hectare, and then we just added ½ a hectare for luck. But you can, I know it's more, you know, more money, more purchases, etc. But if you do get failed establishment, or you get overgrazing where you lose some species, there are herb-specific purchases from seed companies that you could buy to like stitch in those missing species. But obviously, if your pH is wrong and the herbs don't like it, they will disappear and they won't come back. So we particularly lost sandfoin, which was a shame because it's one of the anti-methane sort of plants. It just would not establish whatsoever. It came up for about 2 weeks and then it disappeared straight away.
Great, thank you, Emily. And a last question for you as well, Emily.
Mm-hmm.
How quickly after establishment were you grazing the herbal leys, and how long were you grazing them for? Like, what was your rotation?
Oh, that's a good stretch of my memory. I'm pretty sure so we ploughed in July 2020. We ploughed in the middle of a drought, and apparently it was worse than ploughing motorway. We sowed seeds, and in September, late August, we very, very lightly grazed it for about 2 days, just with a handful of sheep just to get the tillering. And then we took them back off, let the sward recover a little bit, and by mid-September we were grazing with 40 sheep on each sward type. And those sheep were rotated about every 4 to 5 days, and they grazed until I think it was the first week or second week of December, and then they came off, went to slaughter. So you can graze it pretty quickly, but obviously it depends on the warmth of the year, which warmth of the month, the soil temperature, how wet everything is as well. I wouldn't recommend trying to establish it in a drought like we did. It was a bit stressful.
Great, thank you so much. I do have one last question, which I'm just going to ask, which is for all of you, which is that given that, as we've seen from all 3 of your presentations, context is so important for the types of results, where do you suggest that farmers go to learn more about what might be suitable for their systems? Do you have any advice for them?
I think probably hands-on meetings down at either Cotswold Seeds. I know, you know, seed companies obviously have their own agenda, so just be careful and mindful of that. There's lots of webinars and research events that are held by institutions such as NIAB. I know there's a plethora of information out there from researchers at, I think it's Chiswick, and I can't remember the other Irish one. John Finn and his team there are also doing research on multi-species swards and herbal Leys. So there is a wealth of knowledge out there. Just be careful where you're looking and who you're looking from. I don't know if, Lydia, you've got any more events with Cotswold Seeds coming up about herbal Leys?
We will have. We've got webinars and events and in-person events going right through for the next 2.5 years. So if you go on our carbon capture cropping site, you will be able to very soon download a grower's guide. The many seed merchants that provide these mixtures, they will also either personally talk to you on the phone or their grower guides on those sites. But certainly, yes, those resources will be on the carboncapturecropping.com site for you to download and check out what webinars and events are coming through in the future. And I think Charlotte probably will be able to tell you about Pasture for Life events also that they stage.
Yes, thank you. I will sort of wrap up there. I'll send a link. Lots of things were mentioned in these talks, and obviously all the different websites and projects and things. So I'll send a follow-up email with a link to this recording, which will be on YouTube, along with any other information that the speakers would like to include. And thank you so much for those who've been completing the feedback poll. So I'd like to thank the Agri-Food Network for funding this webinar, and especially thank you so much to Jonathan, Lydia and Emily. It's been really fascinating and we really appreciate you sharing all your findings and experience. Yeah, it's all been really valuable for everyone. So thank you so much. And if you'd like to see what other webinars we have coming up over the next few months, I think we've got about 30 planned between now and March. So please take a look at the link in the chat. And there's another Herbal Leys event coming up actually this week if you're in the area. So thank you so much to everyone for taking the time to join, and have a good evening.
Perfect. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Cheerio, Robert.
I'll stay here until everyone leaves for the feedback form. Thanks.